Beatrice Schilling watched from the airfield at RAF Kenley as a Hurricane pilot prepared for takeoff. She was 32, had spent 6 years working at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, and still hadn't found an answer to the crisis that kept killing her pilots. That week alone, 43 German Messerschmitt fighters had crossed the English Channel. British pilots had fought them in 27 separate battles. 14 Hurricanes went down, 9 Spitfires lost. The pattern never changed. A British pilot would spot an enemy plane, push his aircraft into a dive to attack, and his engine would die. The German would either escape or circle back to shoot down the helpless Hurricane while the pilot struggled desperately to restart his Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Schilling had read every combat report and maintenance log. She'd interviewed the pilots who made it back alive. The problem was clear. The carburetor flooded when the plane dove suddenly. Basic physics, deadly results. When a Spitfire or Hurricane pushed into a steep dive, fuel rushed to the top of the float chamber. The jet went dry. The engine quit for 1.5 seconds. That brief moment gave a Messerschmitt enough time to close 300 yards and start firing. German planes didn't suffer this weakness. Their Daimler-Benz engines used direct fuel injection. No float chamber meant no flooding. German pilots could dive, climb, roll, and flip their aircraft upside down without losing even a fraction of power. This gave them a critical edge in every fight. British pilots knew it. German pilots used it against them. Squadron leaders reported it constantly. And the Royal Air Force kept losing experienced pilots faster than training schools could replace them. Schilling had been working on this problem for 11 months. The Rolls-Royce engineering teams were building a pressure carburetor that would truly fix everything. But that wouldn't be ready until 1943, maybe 44. The war wasn't going to wait. The pilots couldn't wait. Every single morning, young men climbed into Spitfires and Hurricanes, knowing their own engines might betray them before enemy bullets did. Squadron leader Davies walked past Schilling toward his Hurricane. 24 years old, 41 combat flights, 3 confirmed enemy kills. He'd reported engine failure twice in recent weeks, both times during combat dives. Both times he'd survived through pure luck and thousands of hours of training. He nodded at her. She nodded back. He had no idea she was the carburetor specialist from Farnborough. He probably assumed she was someone's secretary. If you want to discover how Schilling's breakthrough saved RAF pilots, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the war. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Schilling. That morning she'd brought something with her to Kenley, a small brass component, carefully machined, ridiculously simple. Her team at the Royal Aircraft Establishment had tested it on a bench engine for 6 weeks. It worked perfectly, but bench tests weren't the same as combat. Combat meant 300 miles per hour. Combat meant forces strong enough to pin a pilot against his harness. Combat meant life or death decided in 1.5 seconds. Schilling walked to her Norton motorcycle. Inside her leather bag sat the brass restrictor and a plan that would either save the Royal Air Force or destroy her career at Farnborough. By noon, she'd know which. The carburetor crisis began in July 1940. The Royal Air Force had switched to 100-octane fuel. Higher octane meant more power. More power meant 1,310 horsepower from the Merlin engine instead of 1,100. The Spitfire Mark II could reach 370 miles per hour in level flight, fast enough to catch Messerschmitt 109s. But the Skinner's Union carburetor couldn't handle the forces that came with high-speed combat flying. Schilling understood carburetors better than anyone at Farnborough. She joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment in November 1939, 1 month after war began. She was one of 2 women in the engine department. The other woman was a secretary. Schilling was the principal technical officer in charge of carburetor research and development. Most men she worked with had never met a female engineer. Some didn't believe women belonged in engineering at all. Schilling didn't care what they believed. She cared about keeping pilots alive. She'd grown up taking engines apart. At 14, she'd bought her first motorcycle, a Norton. She stripped the engine down to every individual piece, learned exactly how each part functioned, then put it all back together. At 25, she'd raced that Norton at Brooklands at an average speed of 106 miles per hour, fast enough to earn the British Motorcycle Racing Club Gold Star. Only 3 women in history had earned that award. Schilling was the second. Racing had taught her how engines failed under pressure. High-speed turns, sudden acceleration, extreme lean angles. She'd learned to sense what an engine needed before the instruments showed it. That instinct had made her Britain's best carburetor specialist. And now British pilots were dying because their carburetors couldn't handle combat pressure. The solution came to her in January. Simple physics. The float chamber flooded because fuel could flow freely when gravity reversed. What if you restricted the flow? Not completely, just enough to stop flooding. The engine would still get fuel, just not too much. A brass disc with a carefully calculated hole in the center. Install it in the fuel line before the carburetor. Limit maximum fuel flow to slightly less than what the engine needed at full power. She'd made the first restrictor herself. Brass, thimble-shaped 1/25 of an inch in diameter. The center hole was 4/100 of an inch. Those measurements were critical. Too large and the carburetor would still flood. Too small and the engine would starve at full throttle. She tested 17 different sizes before finding the perfect one. Then she simplified the design. A flat washer was easier to make, easier to install, easier to replace if damaged. Bench tests proved it worked. The restrictor prevented flooding during simulated negative forces. But bench tests weren't combat. She needed to test it on a real aircraft under real combat conditions. The problem was permission. Installing unauthorized modifications on RAF fighters broke about 40 different regulations. If the restrictor failed in combat and a pilot died, Schilling would face court-martial, maybe prison. She decided to skip asking permission and beg forgiveness later. That morning at Kenley, she had 6 restrictors in her bag and one very helpful ground crew sergeant who owed her a favor. Sergeant William Cooper had worked on Merlin engines for 3 years. He'd watched 19 pilots die from engine failures. He didn't ask questions when Schilling showed him the brass washer. He just nodded and grabbed his tools. The Hurricane sat on the dispersal pad. Pilot inside. Engine warming, 20 minutes until takeoff. Cooper worked quickly. He disconnected the fuel line between the pump and carburetor. The restrictor slid into place. He welded it with a small torch. 60 seconds of work. The modification was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Schilling checked the weld. Clean, solid, professional. Squadron leader Davies would fly with the restrictor installed. He didn't know it was there. Schilling hadn't told him, hadn't told the squadron commander, hadn't told anyone except Cooper. If the restrictor failed and Davies died, there would be no paper trail, no authorization forms, no testing records. Just a dead pilot and a brass washer that shouldn't have existed. The Hurricane's Merlin engine roared to full power. Davies ran through his checks. Oil pressure good, coolant temperature good, all 12 cylinders firing. He released the brakes. The Hurricane rolled forward, picked up speed, lifted off. Schilling watched it climb. 800 feet, 1,200 feet, 2,000 feet. The Hurricane banked south toward the channel. She'd brought binoculars. She watched Davies climb to 15,000 feet. 2 more Hurricanes joined him. A section of 3 standard patrol formation. They flew toward Dungeness. German fighters had been active over Dungeness all week. If Davies met a Messerschmitt, he'd have to dive, and the restrictor would either work or it wouldn't. Schilling waited on the tarmac. Cooper stood beside her. Neither spoke. Ground crew prepared more Hurricanes for the afternoon patrol. A fuel truck rumbled past. Mechanics shouted technical terms across the dispersal area. Normal sounds of a fighter station at war. Schilling heard none of it. She was calculating fuel flow rates in her head. 4/100 of an inch. Maximum flow at full throttle. Negative force duration 1.5 seconds. The math worked, but math wasn't combat. 40 minutes passed. An hour. Radio silence from Davies' section. That could mean anything. No contact with enemy fighters or contact so intense there was no time to report, or Davies was dead and his Hurricane was scattered across a French field. At 9:37, the radio crackled. Control's voice. 3 Hurricanes inbound, 2 minutes out. Schilling raised the binoculars. She saw them. 3 dark shapes against the morning sky. All 3 aircraft, no losses. The Hurricanes entered the circuit. Davies landed first. He taxied to dispersal, cut the engine, climbed out. Schilling walked toward him. Her hands were shaking. She'd designed bombs before. She'd tested engine modifications under laboratory conditions. She'd never done anything like this. Never installed an unauthorized modification and sent a pilot into combat to test it. Davies pulled off his helmet. He was smiling. That was strange. Pilots didn't smile after combat patrols. They usually looked exhausted, haunted. Davies looked excited. Cooper asked the question, "Any problems with the engine, sir?" Davies looked at Cooper, then at Schilling, then back at Cooper. "Best the Merlin's ever run," he said. Dove on 2 Messers over Dungeness. Engine never missed a beat. Schilling asked Davies to describe exactly what happened. He'd spotted 2 Messerschmitt 109s at 14,000 feet, both aircraft flying east toward France. Davies had positioned his section above them, altitude advantage. He'd pushed into a steep dive, 400 miles per hour, forces strong enough to lift him against his harness straps. The dive that should have killed his engine. But the Merlin kept running, full power through the entire dive. Davies had closed to 200 yards before the German pilot noticed him. He'd fired a 3-second burst, saw hits on the left Messerschmitt's wing root. The German fighter broke hard right and fled toward France. Davies had pulled up, climbed back to altitude. The engine had performed perfectly. It was the first time in 11 months that Davies had successfully pressed a diving attack without his engine cutting out. He wanted to know what maintenance had done to his Hurricane. Schilling told him. She explained the restrictor, the brass washer, the fuel flow limitation. Davies stared at her for 5 seconds. Then he turned to Cooper. "Put that thing in every Hurricane on this station," he said. "Today." Schilling explained it wasn't authorized. Davies didn't care about authorization. He cared about surviving combat. Every pilot at Kenly had lost friends to engine failures. 19 pilots dead in 6 months. Davies said if headquarters wanted to court-martial him for installing an unauthorized modification, they could do it after the war. Right now, his squadron needed working engines. Cooper installed restrictors in 4 more Hurricanes that afternoon. Schilling had brought 6 total. She kept 1 for testing. 5 Hurricanes flew combat patrols with restrictors over the next 3 days. 0 engine failures. 12 diving attacks successfully pressed against German fighters. Pilots reported the Merlin engines ran perfectly, better than perfectly. Some pilots claimed they were getting more power at altitude. Word spread fast. By March 18th, every squadron commander and 11 group knew about the restrictor. They wanted it, all of them, immediately. Schilling received 14 phone calls in 2 days. Could she come to their stations? Could she bring more restrictors? How fast could they be manufactured? The problem was supply. Schilling had made 6 restrictors herself in the Royal Aircraft Establishment workshop. Manufacturing thousands would require proper production facilities, brass stock, precision machining equipment, quality control. She needed approval from the Air Ministry. She needed funding. She needed time. She got approval in 4 days. The Air Ministry fast-tracked her proposal. A war-winning modification, they called it. Rolls-Royce received the production contract. They could manufacture 500 restrictors per week. Installation would begin immediately at every fighter station in Britain. Schilling put together a small team, 3 engineers from Farnborough, 2 civilian mechanics. They would visit RAF stations and oversee installation. The restrictor could be fitted without removing aircraft from service. That was critical. Every Hurricane and Spitfire needed to stay operational. The Battle of Britain was technically over, but German fighters still crossed the Channel daily. RAF Fighter Command couldn't afford to ground its squadrons. Schilling loaded her Norton motorcycle with tools and restrictors. She'd visited 43 RAF stations before the war. She knew every fighter base in southern England. She knew the commanding officers. She knew the ground crews. Now she'd visit them again, this time with a brass washer that would save their pilots. By March 25th, installation teams were ready. 600 restrictors manufactured, 40 stations on the schedule, 3,000 Merlin engines waiting for modification. Schilling started her Norton and headed north toward Biggin Hill. Biggin Hill was the busiest fighter station in 11 Group. 32 Spitfires, 21 Hurricanes, 4 squadrons rotating through constant combat operations. Schilling arrived at 8 in the morning on March 26th. Station Commander Group Captain Grace met her at the gate. He'd lost 7 pilots to engine failures in the past 2 months. He wanted the restrictors installed immediately. The ground crews worked in shifts, 4 aircraft at a time. Each installation took 12 minutes. Disconnect fuel line, weld restrictor in place, reconnect line, test for leaks. The welding had to be perfect. A faulty weld at altitude could starve the engine completely. Schilling supervised every installation personally. She checked every weld, tested every connection, rejected 3 restrictors that didn't meet standards. Pilots watched the modifications with intense interest. Flight Lieutenant James Lacey had 41 combat missions. He'd experienced engine failure twice, both times during critical moments in dogfights. He asked Schilling how a simple washer could solve such a complex carburetor problem. She explained fuel flow physics, float chamber dynamics, how negative forces affected liquid fuel. Lacey understood immediately. He was an engineering graduate from Cambridge. He called it brilliant simplicity. By March 28th, all 53 Merlin engines at Biggin Hill had restrictors installed. Schilling moved to Hornchurch, then Northolt, then Tangmere. The pattern repeated at every station. Ground crews worked 12-hour shifts. Pilots flew combat patrols with modified engines. 0 failures reported. The restrictor worked exactly as designed. Pilots started calling it Miss Schilling's orifice. The nickname came from Sir Stanley Hooker, chief engineer at the Rolls-Royce Supercharger Division. It was crude British humor, slightly inappropriate. Schilling didn't mind. She'd spent 6 years working with RAF personnel. She understood how military men dealt with stress. If crude nicknames helped them remember the modification, she'd accept any name they wanted to use. The nickname spread faster than the restrictor itself. By April, every pilot in fighter command knew about Miss Schilling's orifice. They requested it specifically. Some pilots refused to fly combat missions until their aircraft had the modification installed. Squadron commanders supported them. They'd seen too many good pilots die from preventable engine failures. German intelligence noticed the change in British fighter performance. Luftwaffe After Action reports from early April mentioned improved RAF diving attacks. British fighters no longer broke off pursuit during sudden dives. Messerschmitt pilots could no longer exploit the carburetor weakness. The tactical advantage had disappeared. By mid-April, Schilling's team had installed restrictors in 2,100 Merlin engines. Every Hurricane and Spitfire in fighter command, every operational training unit, every aircraft in reserve status. The modification became standard equipment. New aircraft rolling off production lines at Castle Bromwich and Southampton came with restrictors already installed. The pressure carburetor was still in development. Rolls-Royce estimated it would be ready for production in 1943, but the restrictor worked so well that some engineers questioned whether the pressure carburetor was even necessary. Why redesign the entire fuel system when a 50-cent brass washer solved the problem? Schilling knew the answer. The restrictor was a stopgap, a brilliant stopgap but temporary. The pressure carburetor would eliminate the negative force problem completely. No fuel flow restrictions, no power limitations, full engine performance under any flight condition. That was the proper engineering solution. But until 1943, Miss Schilling's orifice kept RAF pilots alive, and that was enough. The results could be measured. Fighter command tracked combat statistics carefully. Every engagement, every kill, every loss. The numbers told a clear story. March 1941, before the restrictor, RAF fighters reported engine failures in 38% of diving attacks against German aircraft. Pilots broke off pursuit. Enemy fighters escaped. Or worse, German pilots recognized the weakness and exploited it. They deliberately lure British fighters into diving attacks, knowing the Merlin engines would fail. April 1941, after the restrictor, engine failures during diving attacks dropped to 0.4%, almost non-existent. The few failures that did occur were unrelated to the carburetor. Mechanical problems, battle damage, normal combat wear. The kill-to-loss ratio improved immediately. March had been brutal. Fighter command lost 47 Hurricanes and Spitfires in combat, shot down 61 German aircraft, a ratio of 1.3 to 1, barely breaking even. April was different. 29 British fighters lost, 94 German aircraft destroyed, a ratio of 3.2 to 1. The restrictor wasn't the only factor, but squadron commanders credited it as a major contributor. Pilots reported increased confidence in combat. Flight Lieutenant Robert Stanford Tuck flew Spitfires out of Duxford. He'd experienced engine failure 4 times before the restrictor. After installation, he pressed diving attacks without hesitation. He destroyed 3 Messerschmitt 109s in May, 2 more in June. He credited the restrictor with giving him the confidence to commit to aggressive tactics. The modification spread beyond fighter command. RAF Coastal Command requested restrictors for their Beaufighters. Bomber Command wanted them for training aircraft. Even the Fleet Air Arm asked about installation on carrier-based fighters. Schilling coordinated production with Rolls-Royce. By June, they were manufacturing 1,000 restrictors per week. The restrictor remained in service through 1943. Rolls-Royce finally introduced the pressure carburetor in January 1943. The new carburetor eliminated the negative force problem completely. It used fuel injection principles similar to German engines. No float chamber, no flooding, perfect fuel delivery under any flight condition. But converting existing aircraft to pressure carburetors required extensive modifications. Remove the old carburetor, install new fuel pumps, rewire engine controls. Each conversion took 8 hours. During those 8 hours, the aircraft couldn't fly combat missions. Fighter Command couldn't afford to ground squadrons for extended maintenance, so they kept the restrictors. Many aircraft flew with Miss Schilling's orifice until 1944, some until the war ended. New production Spitfires and Hurricanes received pressure carburetors, but older aircraft kept their restrictors. Pilots trusted them. Ground crews knew how to maintain them. If it worked, don't change it. Schilling moved on to other projects. She worked on cold weather starting systems for engines in Iceland and Russia. She researched high-altitude fuel mixture problems. She helped design improved supercharger systems for late-war Merlin variants. The Royal Aircraft Establishment kept her busy with dozens of technical challenges. But the restrictor remained her most famous contribution. Pilots remembered it. Engineers studied it. After the war, aviation schools taught it as an example of elegant problem-solving under pressure. Simple solution, immediate implementation, measurable results. Everything good engineering should be. Keith Maddock, chief engineer at Hangar 42 during the war, said it years later. Beatrice Schilling helped us win World War II. Of that, there is no doubt. The restrictor was a war-winning modification. Schilling's work didn't stop with the restrictor. The Royal Aircraft Establishment had dozens of critical problems that needed solutions. Engine failures at high altitude, fuel system icing in extreme cold, starting problems in Arctic conditions. Every problem threatened pilot lives. Every problem landed on Schilling's desk. She worked on cold weather modifications for Spitfires sent to Murmansk. Russian winter temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Standard engine oil turned to sludge. Batteries died. Fuel lines froze. British pilots couldn't start their aircraft. Soviet ground crews had no experience with Merlin engines. Schilling developed a cold start procedure using preheated oil and modified fuel mixtures. It worked. Spitfires flew combat missions over Murmansk through the winter of 1941. She researched high-altitude performance problems. Late-war Spitfire variants flew at 35,000 feet. The Merlin engine struggled at that altitude. Thin air, low oxygen content. Fuel mixture had to be precisely balanced. Too rich and the engine flooded. Too lean and it overheated. Schilling developed altitude-compensating carburetor modifications that improved power output by 8% above 30,000 feet. Her personal life remained separate from her work. She'd married George Naylor in September 1938. He worked at the Royal Aircraft Establishment as an aerodynamicist. When war started, he'd volunteered for RAF Bomber Command. He flew Avro Lancasters with 625 Squadron, 31 combat missions over Germany. He earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for completing an extra tour beyond his required missions. Schilling worried about him every time he flew. She understood bomber loss rates. Bomber Command suffered higher casualties than any other RAF branch. 1 in 2 bomber crew members didn't survive the war. Naylor beat those odds. He survived his tour and returned to Farnborough in 1944. They never talked about his missions. He never asked about her projects. They kept work and marriage in separate compartments. Schilling continued racing motorcycles when time allowed. She'd stopped racing at Brooklands when war started. The famous circuit had been converted to aircraft production facilities, but she still rode her Norton. Fast riding helped her think, solve problems that laboratory work couldn't crack. Some of her best engineering ideas came while riding at 90 miles per hour on country roads. By 1945, she'd worked on 17 major projects at Farnborough. Cold weather systems, high-altitude modifications, carburetor improvements, fuel mixture optimization, supercharger efficiency upgrades. Each project saved lives. Each project kept RAF aircraft operational under extreme conditions, but none achieved the fame of the restrictor. The war ended in May 1945. Germany surrendered. Japan followed in August. The Royal Aircraft Establishment transitioned from wartime emergency projects to peacetime research. Slower pace, lower urgency, different priorities. Schilling stayed at Farnborough. She had no intention of leaving. Engineering was her life. In 1948, she received official recognition for her wartime contributions. King George VI appointed her Officer of the Order of the British Empire. The ceremony took place at Buckingham Palace. Schilling wore her formal dress, accepted the medal, posed for photographs, then went back to work at Farnborough the next morning. She never stopped engineering, never stopped solving problems, never stopped proving that women belonged in technical fields. Her career at the Royal Aircraft Establishment continued for another 21 years. But the restrictor remained her legacy, the brass washer that saved the Royal Air Force. Schilling worked at the Royal Aircraft Establishment until 1969, 33 years of continuous service. She never reached the top administrative positions. Those roles were reserved for men. The RAF leadership structure didn't promote women to director-level posts regardless of accomplishment. Schilling accepted this limitation. She preferred hands-on engineering work anyway. Laboratory testing, field modifications, real problems with real solutions. Her post-war projects included the Blue Streak missile program, Britain's first ballistic missile. Schilling worked on fuel delivery systems and high-altitude performance. She researched wet runway braking effects for jet aircraft. Landing accidents killed more pilots than engine failures by the 1950s. Understanding how water on runways affected tire friction could save lives. Schilling published 3 technical papers on the subject. She even helped design a bobsled for the Royal Air Force Olympic team. Strange project for an aeronautical engineer, but bobsled design involved aerodynamics, weight distribution, and friction management. Skills Schilling had mastered over 30 years. The RAF team used her bobsled design in competition. They didn't win medals, but they didn't crash either. Schilling retired in 1969 at age 60. She spent retirement restoring vintage motorcycles, racing occasionally at classic motorcycle events, maintaining her Norton. She'd kept the same motorcycle since 1934. The machine she'd raced at Brooklands, the machine that had taught her how engines behaved under extreme stress. She died on November 18, 1990. Age 81, survived by her husband George and a lifetime of engineering achievements. The obituaries in British newspapers focused on the restrictor, the brass washer, Miss Schilling's orifice. Everything else she'd accomplished was footnotes. Her legacy lived on in unexpected ways. In 2011, a pub in Farnborough was renamed the Tilly Schilling. The Brooklands Museum purchased her racing trophies and badges in 2015. Winchester Heritage celebrated her in 2018 as one of Hampshire's extraordinary women. In 2019, Royal Holloway University opened the Beatrice Schilling Building for electronic engineering students. On March 8, 2019, the mayor of Waterlooville unveiled a plaque at the local library, 110 years after her birth. The restrictor itself became a teaching example. Engineering schools worldwide studied it. Simple solution to complex problem. Immediate implementation under wartime pressure. Measurable, life-saving results. Everything good engineering should achieve. Some universities kept original restrictors on display. Small brass washers in museum cases. Reminders that elegant solutions don't require complexity. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor and hit that like button. Every single like tells the platform to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every day. Stories about engineers who saved lives with brass washers and brilliant thinking. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from Texas, Germany, the United States, Japan? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Beatrice Schilling doesn't disappear into silence. She deserves to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Sonnet 4.5.